Hey everyone, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 5, Adaptations for Survival. Today's focus will be looking at the limiting factor of temperature and desiccation, in particular a couple animals in the Australian outback. So today is all about animals and their adaptations for survival. Next one will be about plants. So quick check where are we up to at the moment. If you're following along with Canvas, this will take you to lesson 2 of week 1, so chapter 5. By this point, you should have watched a previous lecture or done the equivalent slides or notes or YouTube video, whatever you prefer, and completed quick check questions 1 to 9. This is what we're doing today. And sorry about that. And next class we'll be doing, and after the end of this lecture, you'll be doing quick check questions 10 to 13, and then the next lecture. All right. So we know a little bit about the Australian outback, very arid, very dry. So of course, there is still a huge level of biodiversity, still a huge range of creatures that exist and thrive, actually survive really well in the Australian outback, but they don't do it easily. They do it due to a range of adaptations. Here's a little funny little creature, and this is a mulgara. This is an animal that does not actually drink dietary water. All of its water comes from humidity in its food. As you can see, that's eating a little bug, and also some metabolic water, which we learnt the other day that we produce water from cellular respiration. So a couple things, a couple adaptative features for this creature to minimize its water loss is that it has very concentrated urine, very dry feces, doesn't really have many sweat glands, and it's going to have a few behavioral adaptations. Let's look at that a little bit more closely by looking at another creature. This is called the tarkawara, or the Spinifex Hopping Mouse, quite a well-known Australian creature. You can pause this at any time and have a look through at this diagram because it's quite rich, but I'll point out a couple things. Let me break it down into behavioral, structural, and physiological. So one of the behavioral adaptations to a dry, arid, low water, desiccated environment is that something that behavioral that this creature does is that it burrows. It burrows underground where there's more humidity, and when there's more bodies together creating more humidity, that's going to increase water. It's going to increase water retention. Another behavioral thing it does is that it hunts primarily at night. So at night there is more humidity because water is cooler, it condenses more easily. So it's going to be hunting for seeds and bugs, insects I should say, at night. So behavioral adaptation. A structural adaptation of this Spinifex hopping mouse is that it does not actually have any sweat glands. Doesn't contain sweat glands. Some water might diffuse out through its skin, but it doesn't have devoted sweat glands. So that's a structural thing, the way it's built. A physiological adaptation of this creature is that usually when we exhale air through our nose or our respiratory surfaces, we exhale a bit of vapor as well. What this creature has is that it has a cooling mechanism. So when it's expiring air out of its nostrils, that air is cooled. And if that air is cooled, that means some of that water that's in the air, some of the water that's in the air that it's breathing out, can condense back in the nose. So water in more humid and hot climates, hot air can hold more water. So cooling the air that it breathes out means that some of that water vapor in its air is condensed and retained. So that is a really good one to pause and have a look at and see how many behavioral, structural, and physiological adaptations equip it to live life in this arid, dry environment. Spinifex Hopping Mouse is a great in-depth study of one creature that has multiple adaptations. Let's look at different types of adaptations applied to different creatures. So survival by dormancy. Dormancy is sleeping, resting. A dormant volcano doesn't erupt anymore. Dormir en français means to sleep. Dormancy is an inactive state where the metabolic needs of an organism are reduced. So for example, this is a little frog here, and we often think of frogs living in quite watery environments because they need to breathe through their skin, and as we know, respiratory surfaces must be wet. However, how does this frog exist in the harsh, dry conditions of the Australian outback? Well, what it actually does is a couple things. It does something behavioral, something physiological. The frog burrows deep into the ground where there is a little bit more moisture than there is at the surface. That's one thing that it does. And then it creates a mucosal coating by basically spit and allowing that to cover the surface of the frog. So the frog goes into a state of dormancy, so extremely low activity where its breathing and heart rate is reduced, deeper in the ground and covered in this mucosal lining to protect it from desiccation, from drying out. Other things can do to escape the limiting factor of heat is moving around. So migration and burrowing, the thing that we talked about recently in the part 1 of chapter 5. So this is a budgerigar migration. Budgies are native to Australia. Really, the thing with this is that it's really only limited to creatures who are able to fly. So birds you often see on mass migration looking for freestanding water, so little water ponds, oases, little lakes and streams, always seeking out freestanding water. Water is life. Another thing that outback creatures do to survive is through their offspring. So as we know, in Australia, we have periods of very, very intense drought, and drought kills. Drought can persist for not just months, but years, sometimes even decades. And when there is a drought, that's going to kill masses of populations of different creatures. However, these creatures still persist in the environment years and years, and they come back even though their populations have been wiped out. The reason how they do this is via their offspring. So for instance, this is called a fairy shrimp. It is a native Australian animal, and obviously it needs water to survive. It usually lays eggs in water, as you can see a little egg sac there. However, during periods of intense drought, when there is not much water availability, what the fairy shrimp does is it actually has fertilized eggs and sort of lays the embryo encased in a waterproof cyst. So it looks like an egg, but it's actually an embryo that's been attenuated. Attenuated means its growth or its development has been stunted at a point. So it's like a fertilized little egg, and that egg can only open up when it's exposed to water. This is something that happens in plants and other creatures as well, that they have water-soluble coatings that only can germinate or hatch when exposed to water. So we've talked a lot about heat. Let's talk a little bit about cold, the other end of the limiting factor. So ice can kill. We are mostly water, remember. Most creatures are between 70 and 80 to 90% water. So what's stopping certain creatures from having their own fluids in their cells freezing? Lots of marine creatures and deep sea creatures have something called antifreeze, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a molecule that prevents the fluids in the cells, the cellular fluid, from freezing. Most fish have this. Another thing we talked about, polar bears yesterday. Polar bears have an excellent insulation. So they're covered in a thick layer of fat or blubber, same with seals, same with penguins. This is obviously to protect them from the cold. Fat is very, very protective. It's a really good insulator. And that would be a physiological feature. A behavioral feature would be hibernation, so escaping the periods of extreme cold by burrowing underground, seeking shelter, hibernating together for warmth. Okay, now this is something that's a little bit more physiological, something that we can't always observe as easily. Creatures that live in cold environments need structural, physiological adaptations so that the blood that is going to their core is not cold all the time. It's important that we maintain a constant internal temperature. Our organs, this is true for all creatures, our internal organs need to be maintained at a constant internal temperature for them to function efficiently and adequately. So how do creatures like dolphins and whales and penguins and seals all maintain their internal organs warm despite living and existing in rather cold environments? And they do this via this countercurrent system. We know that things that are like flat, or things that you have lots of. So for your hands, for instance, that would be a great one, or your flippers if you're a seal, have a large surface area to volume ratio. And things that have a large surface area to volume ratio are going to cool or be more affected by changes in temperature more rapidly. So how do these structures maintain a warm internal organ? Countercurrent system. This is basically how it works. So blood going from the heart is warm. Remember, artery is away from heart, so arterial blood from the heart is warm. As it travels around, it cools and cools and cools as it reaches towards the surface, the external thing. This is like the water that you're in. Blood that travels from the skin, so to the heart. So if it's to the heart, it's veins. So artery away from heart, veins to heart, also known as veins to venous circulation. So it seems like the warm blood would be cooled and that cool blood would be sent back to the central system. Not quite. The warm blood that is leaving the heart, the core, some of that warmth transfers across to the vein. So see this little thing here, transfers across to the vein. And that means that the blood that is returning back to the core via the veins is warm still. So that's one part, it's warm. The core is maintained as warm. It also means that the blood that is at the surface, so near the flippers, near the equivalent of hands, near the fins and that sort of thing, is cool. And if it's already cool, that means that less heat can be lost here at the body surface. That's a good one to spend a little bit of time on to think about. I recommend redoing a diagram like this for yourself, but once you got it, it makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's move on to our last little bit. This is an adaptation called biomimicry, and I think we can sort of figure out what it means by the terminology. Bio, and we know that means life. Mimicry, to mimic or copy something. So yesterday we talked about how humans are one of the only creatures that use technology as an adaptative behavior. We're the only ones that use technology beyond our own physiology to escape or deal with our limiting factors. One of those ways is biomimicry. So this is a Shinkansen, or a bullet train in Japan. They move very, very fast. And they have this very beautiful streamlined aerodynamic structure. This is a kingfisher, same sort of thing. This is a kingfisher that needs to go very, very fast at high speeds to hunt. This sort of body structure you see in sharks and peregrine falcons. Sharks and peregrine falcons are creatures that have existed and adapted to their conditions for millions of years. So they are streamlined. They have these aerodynamic body plans because that is that has benefited them as a species. So those creatures with the most aerodynamic systems have passed on their genes successfully, hence evolution. And then humans are able to use technology to capture this within just a couple of years. Some other examples is something like Velcro. So Velcro actually works because one side is like loops and the other side is hooks. So with each hook, they actually loop onto it, and that's why it's like hard to rip apart. This was copied from something called burrs, and burrs are little plants that spread their genetic material, their seed, via attaching to the legs of birds and other small creatures. Another example of biomimicry, life mimicry, is this water and dirt resistant paint. So lotus have this amazing feature of actually, they grow really well in dirty environments, but they themselves are quite clean. It's like quite like metaphorical. But if you look at the leaves, why they stay water and dirt resistant is because each leaf has like microscopic bumps. So that means when the water droplets run through these bumps, they don't pool in any one spot, but they travel through, and as they travel through, they collect bits of dirt and that gets washed away. That exact same feature was recreated in certain types of paints. Lucky last one is looking at something like a shark. So again, sharks are incredible. They're so perfectly adapted to their environment, their aerodynamics, their teeth, everything. Their skin if you look at it microscopically, looks like this. So you can imagine that water passing along this as the shark moves through its liquid environment is very aerodynamic. And this is a feature that we have copied in planes and other vehicles to reduce drag, to reduce the force to reduce air friction, basically. Cool. That was basically animal adaptations. After this, you're going to be doing quick check questions, 10 to 13, so not many. And then very soon you'll get the last little bit for this chapter. Amazing. Thank you so much. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.